They told me I need to get through this in 45 minutes, so they're on track at 9 o'clock. So we'll go a little bit faster than normal, but if you've got questions, raise your hand or interrupt me as we're going along, because I find that if you don't ask the questions at the time that the information is being presented, you forget by the time the presentation is over. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the basics, feed and water testing, nutritional problems that we're encountering over the last few years, management concerns, loss of forage quality in the dry years, mineral and trace mineral supplementation, and then talk a bit on how the feeding program impacts the reproductive efficiency of the breeding herd. So the basics of feed testing is, no matter what you're feeding, you need to go ahead and use a probe or find a way to get a representative sample of the forage and get the sample sent in for analysis. If you're going into large square bales, round bales, you go between the twines with the forage probe, core sample 20 different bales, and then that way you've got a good representative sample. Always go between the twines. For pit or bale silage, or pit silage, or bag silage, take handfuls at roughly, again, 20 different locations on the pile with either a W or an M design, or sorry guys, I'm going to get it here yet. Use either a W or an M to get representative samples across the face of the pit from side to side and up and down. Grain pellets, grain samples, pretend you're an elevator agent and you're taking sample for dockage, and you'll do a good job that way. Your test should be for all the major nutrients: protein, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium, and sodium as the basics. If you want to get a little bit more specific and get into the trace minerals, copper, manganese, and zinc are definitely things that you need to consider. We know that iodine, cobalt, and selenium are deficient across all of Western Canada, and selenium, basically, from what I'm hearing, is deficient from all across Canada. So if you're having troubles or you're using unusual feedstuffs, if you're using canola as a salvage crop, you need to look for sulfur content. If you're growing crops on areas that have been used for swath grazing or winter feeding areas, always check for nitrates. And if you find that your bales were put up a little bit too tough and they've heated on you, you need to get into the acid detergent and soluble nitrogen to see how much available protein you have compared to the total protein in the feed. Grab samples. Saves you a little bit of time, but it's going to cost you money. As you can see on the top part of the slide, you can have a 2% differential in protein content and about a 5-point differential in energy. If you're looking at a lactating cow ration and you're using the grab sample numbers, you're going to need to feed roughly 4 to 5 pounds more barley or some sort of energy source as grain or corn, and a pound of protein supplement. And that'll be roughly 50 cents a day differential compared to the results that you would get off of a core sample. The other thing is, some labs are offering NIR, or near-infrared spectrometry, as the method of analysis. Works great for the fibers and the proteins, but it is not accurate for the mineral content. Those should always be done by wet chemistry. From the Canadian Cow-Calf Management Survey in 2017, 60% of the respondents feed test, and 90% of the people that have those test results use them for ration balancing. And only 60% of the people that were responded do not test for their water. And I think that's going to be the big challenge, especially Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and the drier parts of the provinces where there wasn't enough water to recharge the dugouts, very little runoff. Mineral concentrations will be a problem, and you can have some real difficulties. So in 2017, there was a grazing reserve north of Turtleford, Saskatchewan, where they turned some animals into a new paddock, and 4 days later they had 200 dead cows. They tested the water for total dissolved solids, electrical conductivity, and mineral content. And what they found was the sulfur content in that water was extremely high, and those cows died from polio and an enlargement or a swelling of the brain because of a lack of thiamine. So they went ahead and started a project where they were trying to figure out, okay, how bad is this problem? And they found that only about 40% of the water samples that they took were safe to use. 60% were unsuitable. And the reason that if you look at the Canadian standards for water quality for livestock, they say that if you have 2,000 parts per million sulfates in the water, that is basically your cutoff line for use with cattle. And unfortunately, what they didn't take into consideration when that general guideline came into place is there's a difference between the amount of water that they consume on a warm day versus a hot day, lactating versus dry. And you have to use those guidelines with a little bit of caution, because once you get over 0.4% sulfur in a ration, it drops the pH of the rumen, kills off the bacteria that produce the thiamine, and you get the polio problems. So if the animal's only drinking about 63 liters of water in a nice 23-degree temperature, you can get away with that up to 3,000 milligrams of sulfur per liter of water, and you're right at that upper limit of 0.4%. If it's a 35-degree temperature and they're drinking 112 liters of water, that limit drops down to less than 2,000, or right around that 2,000 range. 1,500 would be where I'd consider to be safe. So it's not just the guidelines, you have to consider how much water they're going to consume on those hot days. Water consumption on pasture, when they went ahead and fenced off the dugouts and had the cows drink out of a pump system, a nose pump or a tank, what they found was over a 30-day period, those cows that were drinking out of the system were gaining roughly 15 to 18 pounds more weight compared to the cows that were drinking at a dugout and not gaining any weight. It also affected the amount of milk and the amount of feed that these animals were eating, or milk that was being produced, and the amount of feed that the cows were able to consume. And over those 30 days, you got a 25-pound differential in calf growth rate. So keeping the cows out of the streams, keep them out of the dugouts or the creeks, and having that cleaner water going to them really does pay a big dividend. Management concerns. This is work that was done back in 92 and 93. 93 was a nice year where we had normal rainfalls. This work was done just outside of Edmonton. We tested 13 different types of forages, grass forages, and cut them on a weekly basis. And we found on a normal year, it was about the middle to the end of August when we peaked out on our total forage production. And you can see that there's big differences between the different types of grasses that are being used. So it's not only the water availability, but the species of grass that are being fed or being grown to see what you can get for an optimum yield for your area. And each area is going to be different. 92 was the first year we did the trial. And by the 12th of August, basically 5 weeks or 4 weeks earlier, we found that yield was starting to drop off, protein levels were dropping off significantly, and energy contents were down. So in a year like this, for Western Canada, where we're short of water, Ontario, Quebec, and where you've got water wings on the cows to keep them afloat when they're trying to graze through the swamps, it's a little bit different. But when you have the dry conditions, you're going to lose between 1 and 1.5% protein per week after that grass has headed out, and you're going to lose between 3 and 5% of the TDN values. So waiting for that grass to grow a little bit more in the dry conditions so you get a better yield, you're really hurting yourself for quality. You're better off to take the cut early and try to find some rain somehow and get a reasonable second cut. Nitrates is something that we always have in the back of our mind. Drought, hail, light frost, That's when you're going to have the nitrates occurring. It all depends on the history of the field. Has it been used for winter feeding areas or swath grazing for a number of years? Your chance of nitrate is going to go up. How much fertilizer has been applied? What's the history of the field? After a light frost, nitrate levels will peak about 4 days after the event, the injury event, be it hail or frost. If the plant recovers, it'll get back to normal after about 10 to 14 days. If it's a killing frost, you have no nitrate concerns because that plant is dead. It cannot move nutrients back up to the top of the plant. Herbicide injury or weeds that are dying and you're cutting a crop as a salvage and you've got dying weeds in there, nitrates can be high. And the one misnomer that I get every year, and I wish I had $1 for every call I get on this one, is how do I get rid of the nitrates that have accumulated in my alfalfa? Alfalfa is a legume. It's got the nodules in the root system. It regulates the amount of nitrogen going up in the plant. So you cannot get nitrate accumulation in the legume crops. Ergot, on a wetter year, you get the sclerotes developed. They release the spores. They infect the heads of the plant during flowering. And the toxic principles, the ergot alkaloids, they are present in that plant at the infection stage when you can see a drop of moisture on the outside of the kernel. It's called the honeydew stage. It's toxic at that point on. The concentrations of the alkaloids will not change. Now, big thing is the ergot alkaloid contents that they're finding at the U of S when they've done the last testing over the last 3 or 4 years is the ergot content in the species we have here in Western Canada are 2 to 3 times more toxic than what they have down in Oklahoma, Texas, and Florida. So the problem here is a lot more difficult to work with. The big thing is the subclinical symptoms of ergot poisoning, the reduction in conception rates, silent heats, excuse me here, just I'm thinking too many directions all at the same time. In the summertime, the animals with the ergot alkaloids, what happens is there's a restriction of blood flow to the extremities of the body. So you get a heat buildup or hypothermic situation in the summer and hypothermic or the cold stress when it gets into winter. Now, this gangrenous symptoms of ergot occur 4 to 6 weeks after a fairly high contamination rate. But in this situation, when you get that gangrenous form, it's not reversible. On a slide that I pulled out, the first symptom that you see when you get ergot contamination in a feed is feed refusal. If you get a load of pellets or something in and there's ergot contamination, 2, 3, 4 days after those animals start on that feed, you'll see feed refusal. They'll drop feed intake by 30, 40, 50%. They'll show signs of almost shipping fever or pneumonia-like symptoms, and those appear way faster than what you have with the gangrenous form. And it's going to be a seesaw battle. The intake will go down for 2 or 3 days. If you treat them with licomycin or some other antibiotic and they come back in, they start eating again, that feed intake will drop. So it's a yo-yo, and it's a great indicator that you've got a problem. Rules of thumb that I use for energy and protein for mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy, and after calving cows is 7, 9, and 11% protein on a dry matter basis with energy contents of 55, 60, and 65% TDN. These are much higher than what they use in NRC or the National Nutrient Requirements of Cattle. And the reason is with NRC, they have their experiments in barns, it's 20 degrees Celsius, perfectly warm, no wind, perfect environmental conditions. This takes into consideration the wind and the rain and the cold temperatures that we have in the wintertime. Swath grazing or corn grazing, controlled access is key. You don't want to go more than 3 days before you move the cows. A lot of people, if they want the higher performance, they rotate them every day or move the fence every day. Calcium and magnesium are deficient in this crop. All cereal crops are typically deficient in calcium and magnesium. You need to use a high calcium mineral similar to what they use in feedlots. 20% calcium, 3% phosphorus, probably 3, 4, 5% magnesium depending on the area. And watch the manure. Corn is notorious for being low in protein. So if you see the manure not being a nice flat patty and it looks normal and it's starting to peak and be lumpy, that's an indication that you've got a lack of protein. 2-year-old hay, very hard to find any of that in this part of the woods after last winter, but if you do have 2-year-old hay, your digestibility drops by about 10%, feed intake drops, you're going to have a reduction in bale weight, energy content as well. So don't be surprised if you find that 1,400-pound bale when it was made is down to 1,150 to 1,200 pounds when you're actually feeding it out. It does occur. The longer that hay is in storage, the more losses you have unless it's under a shed. And the big thing is your vitamins. 6 months after a hay crop is cut, the vitamin precursors of vitamin A and E start to oxidize and they disappear out of the hay. So you need to supplement. There's nothing left in the 2-year-old hay. There's no vitamins left in silage either. It's all destroyed during the fermentation process. A feed waste trial that we did 2007, 2009 using a bale processor, we found that there was, versus an unrolled bale of hay, 90% brome, 10% alfalfa, had 13% feed waste from the unrolling situation and 19% from the bale processor. If you're using a bale processor, build yourself a bunk. Something that's drill stem, for example, works very well. 28 feet long, about 5.5 feet wide, 30 to 35 inches tall. That'll fit a round bale of hay, 1,400 pounds, and that'll feed 40 cows. And that way you get your waste down to zero. It's not only the waste, it's the particles that are being lost. 75% of the feed that was wasted or lost in the snow was less than 3/4 of an inch. Typically the fine leaves, the flowers, any of the real nice young material that's on that plant, 75% of it was lost, and that's the ones that have the highest nutrient content of that forage. So you can see on the protein, the feed test result that came back before we actually fed the feed was 11%, down to 8.6% protein from the feed that they actually consumed. So the nutrient loss was much higher than the physical loss from the feed. Macro and trace minerals. Free choice mineral intake. Sometimes you have to use it on pasture, but realize that it's going to be any place from 3 to 4 days, up to 5 days between visits where the cows actually go to the feeder or the salt station to actually come and eat from that facility. And intakes can vary from 1 to 700 grams. That's 1.5 pounds in one visit. That's work that Rob Hand did up in the Westlock area back in the late 80s, early 90s. One that I find really interesting is the calves. They're experimenting with what they're eating and learning to eat. They're eating up to 2.5 pounds of mineral a day, or 2.5 pounds of mineral and salt on one visit. So free choice works as best as it can, but if you've got the opportunity to force feed throughout the rest of the year with silage or in the grain mix, that is the preferred method to provide the minerals. Selenium and vitamin E. This is one that regulations were made in 1973 with Health and Welfare Canada getting involved with the discussions. And what they determined was the maximum amount of selenium supplementation for beef cows would be 3 milligrams per head per day. And what Health and Welfare Canada was worried about was, and I'm putting this as politely as I can, they were scared that 12-year-old girls were going to look like they were 18 because of the selenium content in the meat or in the milk. So that's why they put the regulation in. What we found from feed test results is some parts of Canada you are getting 3 or 4 milligrams of selenium from the natural feed sources, supplementing with another 3. You're in that 6 to 7 range on a daily intake basis. And that's where I think it needs to be. The work that I do here in Western Canada, Ontario is the same way. My recommendation is you need to supplement 5 to 6 milligrams of selenium a day and expect only half a milligram to come from the feeds that you're providing to the animals. And you can do that with either a vet script or a producer sign-off on a custom formulation at a feed mill. Now, when you go ahead and you add the increase your vitamin E contents to 300 IUs a day pre-calving and 500 IUs after calving, a lot of the reproduction problems disappear as long as the rest of the program is in place. But we found there was a big advantage of increasing the selenium and vitamin E to the cows and even to the bulls so that they can actually perform up to their potential capability. It's really been an eye-opener to work with that one over the years. Vitamin E is critical for immunity that's passed on through the colostrum. Colostrum is produced in the cow 4 to 8 weeks prior to calving. So injecting the vitamin E to the calf or feeding the vitamin E to the cow after calving doesn't work. You need to have that vitamin E in the ration, at least that high level of vitamin E, at least 3 months for the last trimester of pregnancy, because the only way the calf gets that colostrum or gets vitamin E is through the colostrum. It's something that guys are doing, and unfortunately a lot of the feed companies, because of the cost of vitamin E, the levels that they're being supplemented in some of the minerals products, maybe only 50 to 60% of where they need to be. They're getting on board and bringing the vitamin E levels up, so it's getting better. Magnesium is a catalyst to keep all the metabolic functions going efficiently. NRC, again, 0.14, 0.15% is where they're recommending. Work out of Europe is showing that you need 0.23 to 0.27% magnesium. My minimum for all cattle is at 0.2%. Seems to help the energetics and metabolic efficiencies. We find that copper, manganese, zinc, selenium are deficient in Western Canada, and I'm going to speak on that. Those I would expect would be the same across most of the country. Iodine and cobalt are absolutely deficient. There's none available. So if you've got a mineral program or a salt program on pasture and you're using the blue salt blocks as your only source of supplementation, my suggestion is the next time you go in and you buy your ton of salt, you've got it on the pallet, push it up to the front of the box of the truck and leave it there, so that when winter comes along, you've got enough ballast in the back of the truck so that when the snowstorms hit and you're bucking drifts, you got enough weight to get home and not get stuck. Changing from a blue salt to a fortified TM salt on pasture during the summer, we'll have about a 25 to 30 pound difference in calf weight gain. That's all you have to do. It's going to cost you $4 differential. A cow will go through a bag of salt in a year. So for about $4 to $5 a year, you can improve 30-pound differential on your calf birth, on calf weaning weights. It's also going to impact your reproductive efficiency of the cows. Get a lot more of them to catch on the first cycle, and you'll see a lot more cows actually cycling 30 days prior to the bull turnout, which improves your first service conception rate by 20 to 25%. Work with a nutritionist, work with somebody to balance everything out. Don't be afraid to get a custom supplement built, because it's definitely worth the time and the effort. Loose products will be consumed 25% at a 25% higher rate than a block product. Think of it, when it's 30 below, a cow licking on a block of salt is no different than me going out and licking the fender of the John Deere tractor. Cows will consume 75% of the salt at night. So if you're not getting the consumption that you need, Move a salt station to the loafing area. Cows get up at night. They don't sleep all the way through. They get up, they walk around, they want something to do. So they'll find the salt and eat it. If you've got the ability to mix the salt and the mineral together, do that. Cows have a craving for salt. They do not have the nutritional wisdom to know if they need the minerals that are in the other packages. So if you mix them together, when they're taking the salt, they're also getting the mineral. Makes a big difference. Now, nutrition concerns, sometimes the industry comes out with products that are a little bit less than realistic for supplementation. This is a liquid product. I'm going to call it Product X that was brought out about 4 years ago. It's a liquid product that you either inject twice, 3 times, or 4 times a year. I'm going to pick on the 950-pound heifer. So you give 4 doses a year at 1 mil per 150 pounds at a cost of $13 a head. So what are you actually getting for that $13? Pay attention to the copper. They've got 15 milligrams per milliliter. On the heifer, she's getting 379 milligrams of copper, and that's supposed to do her for the entire year. When you compare what's being supplied to what's actually being provided for that heifer, that works out to 1.04 milligrams per day, and her requirement is 150. If you want to see copper deficiency, look up the side of your Angus animal, put her between the sun and yourself, look along the flank. If you don't have that nice black color on the hair all the way to the end of the hair, or the reds are turning orange, that to me is an indication of copper deficiency. But anyway, in this situation, if this product was used as the sole source of mineral supplementation, reproduction would go all to pieces, everything would fall apart. So sometimes the message that's being given out by these salesmen, you have to watch their noses to see if it's growing while they're talking. Liquid molasses on straw bales, it's something that was done a lot this year because of lack of feed. What's happening there is there's very little macro minerals available from these products because they can't stay in suspension. You've got the protein, you've got reasonable levels of trace minerals and vitamins. This is one label that I found online. Cost of 25 cents per pound, and what they're doing is putting on 70 to 100 pounds per 1,000 or 1,400 or 1,000 pound bale. So in effect, what's happening is a cow's getting roughly 1 pound of this supplement every day, or 1.4 to 2 pounds of molasses uptake per day, depending on how much they're putting on. It will not change the ability of that cow to eat the straw. Straw intake is limited by the amount of neutral detergent fiber, basically the fiber that is hardest to digest. It fills up the rumen, and they will stop eating the straw at about 1.2% of body weight for consumption. It also causes problems with lack of calcium, lack of magnesium. You can see that there's very little energy received by the animals. It does go ahead and improve the proteins, but you still have to provide either a 3-to-1 mineral or a limestone-based product to help improve the calcium-phosphorus ratio. You need extra magnesium as well. So in this case, you're probably looking at 4 ounces of calcium, an ounce of magnesium oxide per head per day to bring that calcium-magnesium in balance. Trace minerals and vitamins, they look pretty darn reasonable in this situation. Body condition score. I've seen so many thin cows over the last 2 years that it's hard to take some days. Now, body condition score is a subjective evaluation of the amount of fat that the cows are carrying over their pin bones and tail head, and that reflects to the total percentage of fat that the animal has in that they're carrying. Now, what you want to have is a cow with a body condition score of someplace between 3.5 going into winter, and you need that body condition score of 3 at calving time. Under the Canadian system, from 1 to 5 as the scale, you're looking at a 200-pound difference in body weight per one body condition score change. The Americans use a 1 to 9 system, so their body condition score is only 100 pounds per one condition score change. So just to bring it out up front, if you've got a cow that's 200 pounds light going into winter, she's going to need an additional 1,400 pounds of hay just to stay warm. Not to gain weight, just to stay warm. And with hay prices in that 8 to 10 cents a pound range this winter, that's $120 to $140 per head going over the winter. Colostrum quality and quantity. This is American data, so they're using the 1 to 9 system. The big thing is the thinner cow cannot produce the quality of colostrum. The IgG or IgM is the short-term immunity that they're getting from the colostrum. And you can see that an animal that is 300 pounds light is only getting roughly half the amount of that antibody. And this one relates to animals getting sick within the first 2 weeks after calving. The IgG, or long-term immunity, you can see the reduction isn't quite as much, but that's when you see your calves getting sick 3, 4, 5 months after calving. It also impacts milk yield. The red vertical line is when the cows actually maximize their feed intake 12 weeks after calving. Peak lactation occurs 8 weeks after calving. If you can't get enough energy into those rations, what the cows will do is they'll mobilize body fat to produce milk. If they convert 1 pound of fat, that produces enough energy to produce 7 pounds of milk. And 7 pounds of milk going into a young calf will reduce in 1 pound of body gain. It's not just if you don't have that energy there, it's not just the loss of the peak lactation. If you're losing 2 pounds at the peak lactation compared to what she's capable of, you're going to lose that amount of milk through the entire lactation period. So it's not just short-term, it's got a long-term effect. Energy supplementation in the last 90 days of pregnancy. What they did was they fed 3 to 4 pounds of grain to cows and heifers in the high group, and in the low group they just fed them the hay or the typical ration without the extra supplementation. You can see for the cows and the heifers in the big group and the cows in the low group, they managed to maintain the cow birth weight. Now this work was done by Bellows back in the mid-'80s, early '90s. Nobody's repeated it. It's out of Montana, and their cows at that time had about 1,100 pound live weight. So these calves may appear to be short compared to today's standards, but the big thing is you can see the heifers that were not, that were still growing, developing that calf, they took energy away from calf growth rate, and they were 12 pounds lighter. That to me is one concern, but the bigger problem was they had to help with 60% of those calves coming out of the heifers. Big differential. Rebreeding potential, for using the same study, what they did was the animals that were fed that extra grain pre-calving and they were a little bit bigger coming into the second breeding season, 21 days shorter days for those cows to start cycling, and conception rates were 20% higher. Another study basically saying the same thing. The thin cows, only 2/3 of them were actually cycling when the bulls were turned out. Those that were in good condition, 90% were calving or were cycling once 30 days prior to the bulls being turned out. And as mentioned before, that'll increase your first service conception rate by 20%. Obese cows, you can kill them with kindness as well. What happens in this situation, if these cows are over fat, more services to become bred because of cystic ovaries, higher levels of dystocia or having calving difficulties, milk yield is down, weaning weights are down, and after 3 lactations, half of those cows are gone down the road because they didn't become pregnant. So you can hurt them by overfeeding as well. Problems that I see coming up in this growing season, and some of them have already come true, is cows were turned out in this neck of the woods, and I guess most of the prairie provinces because of a lack of feed. Cows were turned out to pasture probably 30 to 40 days earlier than what they should have been. Hopefully they got supplemental feed. Problems will be thin. I saw a lot of cows that were thin going into the spring. High open cow rates or poor conception rates are what I'm expecting from these thinner cows. There's no carryover of forages or silage or anything else in a lot of operations. And unfortunately, a lot of these areas that had poor growing conditions over the last 2 years, the hay, the pastures will not produce as much forage as what they should, and they're going to be short of feed. And yes, we got some rain last night and the night before, but there's areas in the province that I expect to be out of pasture within by July 15th, the 1st of August, and they're going to have to start feeding then. So it's a tough time, and guys have to figure out what they're going to do for alternate feeding programs, using alternate feeds, if they're going to use salvage crops or whatever else. It's going to be a lot of challenges this winter as it's coming through. Anyway, hopefully I cut that down to keep you guys on track. My contact information is there. The other thing is they are going to be putting the presentation up on the Canadian Angus website, and there's a recording of our presentation here this morning. So thank you for your time and attention. Any questions?